Good afternoon. I'm Teresa Scorset with Robin Hensel and our special guest, Karen Schraufnagel, for another episode of Can We Talk? We are going to be talking about among many things, we're going to be talking about the trial and sentencing of the Somali youths in Minneapolis who have been convicted of conspiring to commit terrorist acts. Is that pretty much sum it up?
And just in case people didn't watch the last episode, Karen is the founder of Minnesotans Against Islamophobia.
Yeah.
And she attended a lot of the trials. Go ahead, Teresa. I didn't want to interrupt
No, that's
you.
quite all right. Thank you for adding that information. Let's do a little background first. Let's talk about CVE because that's what led up to these young.
We were going to talk, do you still want to talk about what communities can do?
Yeah, let's start with that. Where we left off, we were discussing, and we didn't get to finish, about what communities, small and large, can do to encourage more harmony between the races, the religions, and so on. And in Little Falls here, there's maybe a half a dozen families now that happen to be Somali Muslim, but there are other Muslim families here who are not from Somalia, who have been here for a number of years and are successful in the community. They have kids in the school system. And so in that we don't have an Islamic center here, and we don't have a cleric and an imam. What, for instance, could Teresa and I do? I know recently Unite Cloud, just over this last weekend, hosted a Sambusa Sunday, which was a wonderful event. They had over 500 people that attended for conversations over sambusa. And of course, that's a meat patty that's made by Somalis, and it's a real treat during Ramadan and also during Eid, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned recently to make them, so I'm going to be eventually, maybe we'll have some kind of a show teaching people how to make sambusas. It's quite a long process, and it takes a lot of time. It's like making Asian or Hmong egg rolls.
Yeah.
It's time consuming. But what can we do here locally to help encourage more understanding of the Muslims that are our newest community members?
Right. So, I mean, I think you talked in the last hour, you mentioned Todd Green videos, a Todd Green video included, and also that he's written this study guide, My Neighbor is Muslim. And I think that just being familiar with Islam, and so that you are not so subject to the Islamophobic attacks, so that and trying to challenge those when you hear them. You know, I've been involved in Whites Eliminated Racism for going on 20 years now, and one of the first things that we practiced when we were first coming together as white women trying to challenge racism was just interrupting racist jokes, was just interrupting racist stereotypes, and even just saying, I don't agree with that, please don't use that language in front of me. You do not have to know 1,000 statistics. You do not have to have memorized the Quran to challenge Islamophobia when you hear it, right? So that's an important thing to realize, to just be one of those people, like as white allies we're always trying to do, just trying to be a proxy for the population that isn't present to challenge the bad behavior. You know, if somebody wouldn't say something in front of a Somali Muslim, they should start to feel like they shouldn't say it in front of you either. You know, if there are enough proxies walking around, that's very helpful. So this, of course, just challenges the interpersonal racism of it. We are not talking about the systemic nature of racism here. We're talking about interpersonally challenging it. I think that a lot of groups care. The Council on American Islamic Relations, I believe that Unite Cloud also has these yard signs that say things like, all one people, Muslims are welcome, refugees are welcome, something to be welcoming. We had in the Twin Cities, we had blessed Ramadan signs during Ramadan. So, and we made at Minnesotans Against Islamophobia, we've made stickers that say stand against Islamophobia. We're gonna, and they say it in Arabic, English, and Somali. We're gonna make a new one because apparently this phrase doesn't make a lot of sense in Arabic, even though we translated it literally. A lot of Muslims actually don't know what Islamophobia is. Isn't that incredible? So they're victims of it, but they don't necessarily know the word. So so I think personally challenging. If there are events that you can have, like you mentioned that this station is going to show a talk by Todd Green, another talk by Michael German. You can have a video showing that's a public event, and you can serve your sambusas, and you can talk about, you don't necessarily need to have a cleric there to, I know that it's nice. I know that this is why a group like the Islamic Resource Group that we have in the Twin Cities, they put on these things like Islam 101, the role of women in Islam. They have these little workshop things that are wonderful. And the people who present them have this policy of, there is no question you can't ask me. So ask me the craziest, stupidest thing that you've heard about what Muslims believe, and I will, set you straight on that. So that's really nice to have those people, but they too are just one person, just like each of us is just one person. So we can challenge it as well. And one of the things that I like to do is substitute a population that used to be subject to those types of stereotypes that we are no longer comfortable doing. So like, would you say that about Jews? Well, maybe they would, but it's less accepted, right? Would you say that about Asian people, about gay people? Would you, some of the things that are now not so tolerated, that at one time were, because all these populations have been through this. We're going to talk about the trial, and I'm Jewish, and the Jews went through something similar with the communist witch hunt and the trials of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, where you were sort of had to prove you were a good Jew by being a good American Jew, by being willing to throw these people under the bus, right?
Before we get into the trial and CVE and that, Karen and I were on a conference call the other night. Karen was actually at this event. Was that at the Dawa Center?
Yeah, the Dawa Institute, mosque.
Give the people an update of what happened at that conference call. I just want to share, at the end, I wanted to make a comment, there wasn't time, but I remember my Hmong friend, 20-some years ago, going through an issue with one of her teenage sons, where he joined an Asian gang in the Twin Cities. And if they're not already doing it, I think the Muslim community in the cities should get together with some of the people in the Hmong community. How did they counter everything negative that was coming at the Hmong community when they first came to the Twin Cities? So there's a large population of Hmong in the Twin Cities. And my friend was terrified that her son, distressed, that her son had gotten together with this gang and it was ruining his life. And I think that the Muslim community could learn from the Asian community as to what they did to counter all that. So when you talk to that group again, maybe suggest that.
Yeah. We try things to break the isolation of the community, because even in a place like the Twin Cities, where there are a lot of Somalis, there are places that are very Somali, and other people don't go there. You know, the West Bank of the university has a very large Somali population. Also has an Oromo population, so we have an East African immigrant community that is not all Somali, although to an observer, to an observer they might appear to be the same community, and they're actually not, and they speak two different languages, and so there's a lot of languages being spoken, and so we do try, even just Muslim populations that have been here longer, like say our Palestinian population, that is more integrated, even though there are pockets of, there are areas where they live, because when you move to a new country, you go to where people who speak the language that you speak, people who are familiar with your country, who know your customs, who make your food, that's where you go, you know, and then when the older people don't necessarily speak English, so they want to be able to shop and to eat and to pray and to do those things in places where people speak the language that they speak. So, yeah.
When I lived in Minneapolis, we used to call the West Bank Little Africa, and we did not mean that pejoratively.
Right.
The man that I was involved with was Eritrean, and there were a number of Eritreans there as well, and Ethiopians and Somalians, and just a huge population of people. So it was really interesting getting to know some of those folks.
Yeah. Can you give a little highlight as to what the conference call was about?
Well,
and you initiated that, I'm assuming, right?
We were actually trying to come out of the trial and figure out what our next steps were.
Okay.
But every time, one of our problems, organizing 101, I've been organizing for 20 plus years, and I still don't learn my lessons. So it had been a long time since our last meeting, and so we ended up with sort of another introductory meeting, so we keep not getting to the planning phase. I invited you onto this call because I thought we were going to hit the planning phase, but instead we got a good briefing on the Countering Violent Extremism program of what it's like living under this, and especially Ayan Farah spoke to the crowd for a long time. She is the mother of Mohammed Farah and Adnan Farah, who were both on trial in this trial that just finished with the sentencing. So she is the mother of 2 of the 9 young men who were just sentenced. And so, and at this meeting, we had a very large Somali turnout. I always like it to be mixed. It was the white peace population wasn't as well represented as I would have liked, but the Somali population needs to know about CVE since they are the population that's targeted, and they need to know what happened at this trial, and also the aim, one of the primary aims of CVE is to divide the Muslim community, that's the Somali community and the Muslim community generally. This is one of the problems with the CVE program is that it perpetuates a narrative that you might call good Muslim, bad Muslim, right? So if you are not a violent extremist, if you support the government in figuring out who the potential violent extremists are, then you are a good Muslim. If you are a violent extremist, if you are a potential terrorist. Now, of course, remembering that wearing a hijab defines you as a potential terrorist, remembering that being concerned about what's happening to Muslims around the world, remembering that being concerned about the quote-unquote war on terror and how it is targeting predominantly Muslim countries around the world with warfare that is sometimes even drone warfare, no soldiers anywhere near the place, we're just bombing weddings in countries over there. You know, the only way we learn geography is by bombing a country, so that's, you know, an important educational policy, but anyway, you know, keeping in mind that that is what defines you as an extremist under the Countering Violent Extremism program, caring about what's happening in the rest of the world, opposing the war on terror, being identified with your religion, being identified with the country of your ancestry. Those things make you potentially an extremist. And then, but if you are not an extremist, if you support the government unconditionally, then you are a good Muslim. So this good Muslim, bad Muslim narrative is very dangerous. And that is actually kind of the Democrat side of the Democrat-Republican debate about Muslims. So the Republican, Trump has repeatedly said that there are no good Muslims. Just like he said about Mexicans, that they're all rapists and murderers, and then he said, oh, there might be a few good ones, you know, somebody caught him. But on Islam, he's been pretty clear there's no such thing as a good Muslim. In fact, in the Twin Cities, when he came to Minneapolis, there were Somalis who went to see him, Somalis who supported him, and they were called out. You are the problem. You guys are the problem. These guys who had supported him, who couldn't believe they were being, and in a hostile crowd, they were being pointed out as the problem. These are dangerous people, and you guys have a Somali problem here in Minneapolis. So that was, I think, really terrifying for them. But the upside, and we gotta look for those little gems of upside from Trump wherever we can, because they are few and far between. But the upside of a narrative that says there's no such thing as a good Muslim is that it's very unifying.
Yes, I would think so.
Good Muslim, bad Muslim is a very divisive narrative. It's, one where, and a lot of new immigrant populations have been through this, where you have to prove that you're a good American by shunning the so-called bad members of your community. So it's not unusual.
And then we hear a lot about assimilation. A friend of mine stated something I think really relevant, and that is, he thought that it was more of a race issue rather than a religion issue.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we were really concerned as a society about assimilation, why aren't we after the Amish people?
Right.
And the Hutterites and the Hittites and, a variety of groups who are very, to some would be appearing to be reclusive or...
And it's completely separate.
And
Right.
secretive.
Right.
Yeah.
But so it's the race thing more than the religion thing, at least in some people's minds.
That's an arguable point.
Then I've heard this, Islam is not a religion, it's a system.
Yeah.
And we did hear Jamal Dean Omar say that it is a system.
Mm-hmm.
So there's truth to that. But well, go ahead and maybe insert what you want to say about that right here.
Well, no, the thing is, the system thing, religions are ideologies, and ideologies do tell you how to look at the world, your whole sort of life. Christianity is an ideology too, and so it's not probably wrong to say that, but what was I going to say? What were you saying before that?
You were talking about it being a race issue.
Oh yeah, right. So, one of my, again, personal theories that I can't really blame on Minnesotans against Islamophobia is that some of this is quite related to race, and that one of the pieces of the war on terror is like the war on drugs for people who they can't get, for blacks, who they can't get with the war on drugs because they don't do drugs because of their religion.
That's what I know.
Yeah, so it's like their religion that protects them from being swept up in this war on drugs. is what they're being targeted supposedly for. So it's, and one of the things I said during the trial is that in our new justice system post Clinton's, all the criminal justice reform that dates back to Clinton, that actually was Bill Clinton, that was actually the opposite of reform as you would think, that actually made things much harder and much worse. But one of the things that came out of those so-called reforms was 3 strikes, you're out. Well, in the case of this population, I like to say that the 3 strikes are you're black, you're an immigrant, you're Muslim. That's 3 strikes, right? That you don't need 3 criminal convictions. And some of these young men are going away for a very long time. And they've been held since they were arrested. No bail.
How long is it?
So they were,
Summer, or?
the arrests started in February of 2015.
Oh my gosh.
The vast majority of them happened in April of 2015, and the last arrest was December of 2015.
And was that right after the CVE program was implemented in the
Pretty
cities?
quick. It was pretty quick. That's why our local media likes to call it Minnesota's terror trial. I tend to call it the CVE trial because, as I mentioned before, Andrew Luger, who is the federal U.S. attorney for Minnesota, has also been the #1 champion of the Countering Violent Extremism program. I mentioned in the last show that it's the Twin Cities is a pilot city for this program.
Let's just recap that a little bit so we've got context for discussing the trial. CVE is Countering Violent Extremism.
Mhm.
It's a program that's being enforced in Minneapolis, in Boston, and in Los Angeles. And essentially, people are, the program is trying to catch people at the first thought of becoming an extremist so that they can then jail them so that they won't be able to go ahead and perform any terrorist acts. It's just as ridiculous as it sounds. It's a witch hunt. It's McCarthyism all over again. So, but that's in operation now in the Twin Cities. And these 9 young men were swept up in that kind of thought policing. So take us from there.
So the young men were, as I said, arrested over this period of time, especially April 19th of 2015, or 18th, several of them they went into homes. So anyway, so then we had this trial that was mostly in May of this past year, May 2016. So they had already been held, many of them for over a year. None of them were released, even the ones who cooperated. So they were charged with various counts of, you mentioned sort of related to terrorism. So various counts of conspiracy to provide material support for a designated foreign terrorist organization. They were also charged with some of them lying to a grand jury, some of them student aid fraud because they supposedly used student aid money to buy tickets to go abroad. And there were all these different ways that they were supposedly plotting. And the general gist of it was that they were trying to join ISIS. That's what they were being charged with, going to fight in Syria. And this population, the Somali population in Minneapolis, generated a large number. And what do I mean by large? It's like 24, but a number of young Somalis went to join Al-Shabaab in Somalia in 2006, 2007 when there was fighting there. So they've had sort of a target on this community for a while. Of course, that's not a really large number when, a football team riots or something. We say, a couple of dozen young men is not a big deal, but so it's all relative.
Right.
But anyway, So we had many pre-sentence hearings, I mean, many pre-trial hearings, but finally the trial started in May. And by the time we went to trial, there were only 3 young men left who were going on trial. There were, at that point, 2 young men who pled guilty and were cooperating with the prosecution, and there were 4 young men who pled guilty but would not cooperate with the prosecution. But I want to make clear for people who have heard about this trial that the 3 young men who went to trial were never offered the option of pleading to conspiracy to provide material support to a designated foreign terrorist organization. That is a mouthful. But they were not allowed to plead to that charge. And one of the things that happened was that in October of 2015, when they had all already been in jail for 6 months, there was what is called a superseding indictment, which means suddenly there's a new charge. And the new charge was conspiracy to commit murder abroad. Conspiracy to commit murder abroad carries a potential life sentence. So, you have a crime that carries a potential life sentence. You know that no Muslim who has ever been charged with anything related to terrorism has ever been found not guilty at trial in this post 9/11 world. So, if you are offered the possibility of pleading to something less than conspiracy to commit murder abroad, if you are offered the possibility of less than a life sentence, you will take it. So this misinformation is both in the corporate press, but it's also unfortunately on the left, where we have this narrative about how these brave, strong men refused to give in and stood strong and went to trial. That is true, but they're all brave, strong men, and they just simply were not offered. The government had decided who was going on trial for their lives. They had decided that there needed to be a trial. They weren't going to just take pleas from all of the young men. They wanted a trial, and that's part of why I argued that Andrew Lugar was trying to ride this case into a Hillary Clinton administration. He wanted to be Attorney General. He wanted the publicity from trying these kids on terrorism charges, which gets very high level. I mean, front page headlines like this every day. And so much in the lead up to the trial. Like in the lead up to the trial, suddenly they were going to find a route to Syria so that ISIS could follow that route back into the US. So suddenly it wasn't about them going over there. It was about them bringing ISIS over here, which of course is much scarier to the population here. I don't know how much of the population here really cares if young men from the West Bank want to go over to Syria and die in this conflict, which is, pretty much what happens. You join this group and you end up dead. Many of their friends, well, not many, but their friends who they know who have gone are almost entirely dead now, right? So we sat, there was this long trial, 3-week trial. It started very badly and it got worse. The jury selection was very, very poor, right? So we ended up with an entirely white jury. Not surprising, because there were only 3 African Americans in the 102-person jury pool from which the jury was drawn, and only one of them was an immigrant. There was a Kenyan immigrant in the large pool. He was dismissed because his family had been in a camp where Al-Shabaab had been, so they immediately start talking about terrorism right during jury selection. Right. How do you feel about terrorists? So, what are you going to say, that you're pro-terrorist? Yeah. I love terror. So anyway, so it starts right off. But then we end up, of course, with this all-white jury. The jury was not only white, it was older. Now I say this as an older person. Young people have a different relationship to the internet. So the bulk of the trial was to paint these young men as responsible for ISIS's crimes because they watched ISIS videos, right? And the jury, so part of the jury being older is that the sensationalism of these videos is going to have a bigger impact on them than it might have on a young person who sees all this sensationalist stuff coming at them all the time. Young people just live in a very intense world of imagery, constant imagery. They play violent video games. They play, so that was very important. The judge, who is African American and who has been recognized for his civil rights work, but he is also the terrorism judge. He sent away these Somali women who were accused of material support for a foreign terrorist organization for selling t-shirts and sending the money back to Somalia. The support ended up to be a couple of $1,000s. Women with young children serving 18 and 30 years. One is 18, one is 30. So anyway, so the judge could not pronounce these young men's names and kept, every time he said it, he would mangle. I mean, this is just little stuff, but it's building. The opening argument, from the opening statement, the prosecution gets up and it has the slide that says United States versus, I can't remember whether it lists all three young men's names, but say it says United States versus Omar, Daoud, and Farah, because that's the three. The backdrop is an ISIS flag. So this is a PowerPoint presentation, the backdrop of which is the ISIS flag. Every single slide in the presentation, first slide, Glenn Gruder, who's Gulad Omar's attorney, gets up and says that he objects. This is extremely prejudicial. The judge is just like, it's just a slide. These people can tell the difference. I'm like, well then why is it there? Obviously. So, and that's just from the opening argument.
But they were allowed to go forward with that.
They went forward with that. They were, the problem was the judge insisted from the defense side that this was not political. But on the prosecution side, they were allowed to make all of these inferences, And then, of course, we had the very damaging testimony of the two young men who cooperated. The two young men who cooperated were not getting their sentences until the outcome of the trial, which is important, right? They didn't get lesser sentences after promising to cooperate. Their reduced sentences were based on their ability to get long sentences for their friends. So it's held over them that they're not owed anything. It's all going to be up to the judge at the end when everything's decided. So we also know one of the young men, I'm bringing this up because it reminds me so much of as I mentioned, the Rosenberg trial that was part of Jews assimilating in this country. Adnan Farah, one of the young men who pled to material support for a foreign terrorist organization, he was the last one to plead. He held out. They wanted him to plead so badly. They were begging him to testify against his older brother. And I say this because it reminds me of Ethel Rosenberg, who we know now did nothing, but they arrested her and they in fact put her to death, hoping that they were going to get her to testify against her husband, who possibly also did nothing. But okay, so they, Adnan Farah, they had nothing on. all the men, they had little bitty things on, but Adnan they had nothing on. He didn't participate in any of the things that were seen as part of the conspiracy. But they held him, and he pled, and he eventually got 10 years, but he didn't testify at trial. There were 2 young men who testified at trial against the rest of the 3 that were on trial, and there was one, what they call a cooperating informant. We call I don't know what you want to call him. We have lots of bad names for him because he was very, very intimately involved in the prosecution case. It wasn't just that he was saying, yeah, we watched videos and yeah, we talked about joining ISIS. We were kids, which is some of what the other ones were saying. He wore a wire, right? He recorded conversations between the group. He controlled the on-off switch on this recording device. So for example, he has a younger brother that was part of very many of these conversations. This guy's name is Abdirahman Bashir, Abdurizak Bashir. I'm just going to look it up. Abdirahman Bashir, I don't want to mangle it. Okay, so Abdirahman Bashir is the informant in the case. He controls the recording. He doesn't record any conversation that his little brother is involved in, right? Okay. Not only does he control the recording, he does the transcription of the recording, and he translates any of the recording that is not in English. So they speak occasionally in Arabic and often in Somali. He's the one who does the translation. Now imagine you're on trial in Mexico for, you're vacationing in Mexico, but they catch you. They pretend that they caught you for something, and there is a witness against you who translates everything that you said. He's the one, he's testifying against you, but he's also telling everyone what you've said. It's translating what you've said. So this is very unusual. I've heard from a lot of the reporters that it's very unusual for the person who was making the recording to also be the one who's transcribing the recording and the one who's translating the recording. So
that's not only unusual, I think that's unethical.
Yeah.
I think it is too. Is there any way they can get a mistrial?
Well, we don't know what's going to be in the appeal, but they had no problem with it during the trial. Also, and these 3, Bashir and the other 2, Abdullah Yusuf and Abdirazak Warsami, who testified against their friends but were not cooperating all along with the FBI. And they say cooperating, really he was entrapping these kids because he tried to get them, he told them at one point that he could get guns. Nobody wanted guns. He told them if they didn't want to do something that he wanted, that the FBI was telling him he needed to get them on tape talking about, if they didn't want to, he bullied them. There's all this tape of him calling them words that I won't say on your show because the FCC, but he's, you little baby, you little, whatever, don't you care about this or that. So it's a lot of bullying behavior.
Prodding.
And then, of course, the crimes are all of his, he made them all happen. So what 2 of the 3 of them actually got in trouble for was purchasing false passports, which he goes to California, this is Bashir, he goes to California, he comes back with a sample of a fake passport. I'm going to get you these passports. They give him money. Mohammed Farah, Abdirahman Daoud, and Bashir get in a car and go to California to get these passports. They are then supposedly going to cross the border into Mexico and fly to Syria with their fake passports. Now, why do they need fake passports? because there, Gulad Omar, who's seen as the ringleader of the group, which I should also mention, should I stop occasionally or should I just keep going? Gulad is on, at least Gulad is on a terrorism watch list, right? So he can't fly. So he could really use a fake passport. It is interesting that he didn't try to get one. It should show that he wasn't very serious about leaving the country because he tried to fly to California once. Supposedly there was a girl out there that he was, teenage boy. I mean, I should mention that Gulad is 21 and Mohammed is 22 and Abdirahman is 22. Which means they were 19 and 20 at the time of their arrests, and the time when they were supposedly doing all of this horrible stuff. They were legitimate teenage young men. So, so Gulad refused to participate in this purchase of fake passports. How he was going to leave the country is unfathomable because he had supposedly tried more than once. These are the things that he's being charged with because one of the charges is attempted material support to a foreign terrorist organization, right? And attempted means any time that you tried to fly anywhere because it's obvious, no matter where you were trying to go, that you really wanted to go to Syria, right? Attempted is when he got in a car and tried to drive to California. So that's considered an attempt, even though California's the wrong way, and he supposedly was interested in a girl out there. That Bashir, the informant, the instigator, the entrapper, Bashir was going to hook up Gulad with this girl. He said he knew someone. Bashir was from California. He was a good friend of Gulad's before. So, the plot is all between the FBI and Bashir. The kids they were actually going to take a bus, I believe, to California, but Abdirahman Daoud couldn't sell his car. That was going to be where all the money came from, for the passports, for the tickets to get to Syria, which you have to do through another country. But anyway, he couldn't sell his car. Here comes the FBI. I know someone who will buy your car. The guy who's got the passports, in fact, he's going to buy your car. So we'll drive out there. He'll give you cash and he'll give us the passports, right? How convenient. So again, Abdirahman's trying to get out of it. He says he can't sell his car, he doesn't have the title, blah, blah, blah. Nothing is too big a problem for the FBI to solve. Don't worry, I know a guy will buy your car. And oh, by the way, he's also the guy who has the passports. So they drive out there, there's a sting. As soon as they get there, flash grenades, it's all on video, it was shown at the trial, and they're immediately arrested. Meanwhile, the FBI comes into the Joint Terrorism Task Force is in Gulad's home, everything down, dragging them off. All the young men are arrested, like I say, within days of each other, except Abdullah Yusuf, who was arrested much earlier. He had actually tried to get on a plane in, I think, November of 2014 and had been in the radar since that time. So it's very complicated, but the trial was, it's very confusing, all the different charges, everything that they supposedly did. But the thing about the trial, a couple of things about the trial, all these ISIS videos, very, very graphic ISIS videos, showed to a jury that would have been very susceptible to the level of violence that's in these videos. These videos are admitted over defense objections because the young men who are testifying against the young men on trial, the prosecution witnesses, are saying that they too watched the videos. They watched the videos with the young men who were on trial. It's because of that they're allowed to be admitted. So that was much of the purpose of these young men testifying, is that it admits these extremely prejudicial videos. The design of showing the videos is to blame these young men for the crimes in the videos, which are horrific crimes. Beheadings, there's a pilot that's set on fire, burned alive. There are people who are stabbed, and there's a pond, they're walked down to the pond, they are stabbed, or their throats are cut, and they fall into the water. The water is increasingly turning red. It's very, very, very graphic. Even just describing it is graphic, but seeing it is. So, and they are accused as if they are responsible for these crimes simply because they watched these videos. I have watched I watch Vikings on TV. Vikings, it's a series, it's on the History Channel, but it's very graphic, the violence. I do not condone this violence, even if I'm giggling or whatever weird thing I'm doing during the video, right? So, all the young men are convicted. Oh, the final thing I want to say is that the prosecution always goes first. That's the way our system works. And that seems only just. The prosecution is supposed to have to prove that they're guilty. But it is very damaging because the testimony is there. The way the prosecution presents it, it's out there and the jury has heard it. And then the defense, all they can do is say, that doesn't make you poke holes in it. But you know, the videos are not unseen just because they poke a hole in. Was it really true that he watched this video? What did he say? Did he, blah, 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 so they did with each of the cooperating witnesses, they poked very, very large holes in what the cooperating witnesses had said. And especially Bashir, who made close to $120,000 testifying, doing this operation against his friends. Before he started working for the U.S. government, making $4,000 in cash a month. Before that, the best job he had ever had paid $12 an hour. So that's and he believes that he is going to continue to work for the FBI. And he knew all the guys in Syria. He had 3 cousins in Syria. So they were the Syria contacts, right? So one of the things that happens is that happens with all of these cooperating witness cases is that the kids who were really the most guilty, if you believe that anyone is guilty, if you even believe that any of this is really a crime, but if we say that planning to go to Syria to join ISIS is a crime, if we accept the government's definition and agree that that's a crime, the ones who were most caught up in that are the ones who end up helping the government. So the ones who are least cooperative are the ones that end up in the most trouble. And to illustrate that, I just want to say that when CVE came to town, the very first person they went to, maybe not the first, that's hyperbolic, but in the first round of people who were approached to help the government entrap the Somali population, Gulad Ali Omar was repeatedly approached to help the government infiltrate the Somali community. He repeatedly said no. And because he would not help the government, he was public enemy number 1 with a giant target around him, and he ended up with 35 years, the largest sentence. The one who, like I said, never left the Twin Cities, but was somehow going to join ISIS in Syria and kill. Killing is important because that's the life sentence part of it. And the judge said at the sentencing, "You're charismatic, and that's why you're going away for a very long time." He said to him, "I don't believe anything you say, And because there was this idea that they're gonna fake it till they make it, they're gonna say anything that they need to say. This is very convenient because then the judge can dismiss anything that comes out of their mouths. I do want to say a few words about sentencing. Sentencing was very, very traumatic because the judge, first of all, the judge said that he had watched hundreds of hours of ISIS videos to prepare himself for sentencing. The same thing that is the crime that they're essentially on trial for. To psych himself up to sentence them, he watched hours and hours and hours of these extremely graphic videos. At almost every one of the sentencings, they were each sentenced separately. The defendants were made to watch one of these videos in front of the judge while he prodded them. How could you watch this? What were you thinking? And then in every single case, are you a terrorist? And each of the young men said, Judge, I am a terrorist, which was very, very hard to hear. It was part of the defense strategy that moved away from entrapment and tried to take responsibility for what they had been convicted of. The decision being that they would say that they were terrorists and that the process of being caught and being in jail and being in the criminal justice system had helped them to see the error of their ways, and that they were now going to help counter this narrative inside the community. It was a strategy to attempt to mitigate the sentencing phase because they had been found guilty. That it was, I never agreed with it, so it's hard for me to explain it, but there is an element of de-radicalization. This is true if you're a rapist, if you're a pedophile, if you're any of these things. Part of the supposed cure is that you have to admit the crime, right? So you don't qualify for any sort of sexual assault training. If you don't say that you committed the rape, you don't qualify to start on the process of being healed and being returned to society. So the strategy is to admit that you were a terrorist, that you did do these things that you are accused of. You were not entrapped, even though all of us believe that they were. You were not entrapped, you were guilty, but you have seen the error of your ways thanks to the criminal justice system for giving you your life back. One of the things that was so hard is that it didn't do any good. They all admitted that they all said that they were terrorists, and the young men who pled guilty and didn't cooperate, they each got 10 years. The prosecution was asking for 15, they each got 10. Mohammed Farah and Abdirahman Daoud, the prosecution was asking for 30 years, they got 30 years. Gulad Ali Omar, the prosecution was asking for 40 years, he got 35 years. The judge believes that there is what he called a jihadi terror cell in Minneapolis. He believes the community has to admit to this and weed it out. He says it's 9 to 20 people. At the trial, he took copious notes. He was making people spell names. He has appointed himself the terrorism expert of the court system, and he is determined to weed out these terrorists. And like I say, one of the most offensive things is that this is an African-American civil libertarian who has fought against mandatory minimum sentences, the harsh sentences associated with the war on drugs and what it's done to the black community, sending away these Somali kids who have never done a violent thing in their whole lives for most of the rest, in some cases, largely the rest of their lives. And they will serve these sentences in part because of Bill Clinton's reforms,
Yes.
which means that there's no such thing as parole anymore. So
We have very little time left, but it sounds like they were convicted of a pre-crime.
yes,
And there is no de-radicalization in any prison system that I'm aware of.
right.
So I don't understand the defense's tactics of getting them to own up to that. If there's no cure when they're in prison,
It's
where
very,
were they going with that?
they
That
were
seems-
pleading for mercy. They were throwing them, they were saying, I did this, but I'm sorry, and I was caught, so I'm not going to Syria, and I can be much more useful to you in the community, which is true. That part is true. They would be so useful in the community talking to young people about what it's like to go through this system, and that there are other ways other than ISIS videos, to be politically active and to care about the Muslim world. So they would be very useful. And they threw themselves on the mercy of the court. We collected hundreds of signatures asking for mercy on 2 different letters. One that went to the Somali, was signed by Somalis, and one that was signed by peace activists, not from the Somali community. Hundreds of letters asking for mercy. The judge and one of the mothers said to me, Abdirahman's mother said to me after the trial, it's like there was no judge. Just my boy and the government.
Right? So there's no preventing, let's say for instance, any Muslim or any person who's not a Muslim wants to do some research on ISIS, watches a bunch of videos. Guess what? You could be suspected too for a potential pre-crime and then a trial.
It sounds like North Korea.
It's
Doesn't it?
very scary. But the thing is, you have to be in their sights. There has to be a reason that they want to prosecute you.
Right.
Because
Like
the same time this is happening, those young that young man who raped that unconscious girl is getting 6 months because the judge says going to jail could ruin his life. Well, what about these guys?
Well, like you said, there's the 3 strikes. You're
right.
Somali, you're Muslim, and you're...
You're an immigrant, you're black, and you're Muslim.
So they had the 3 strikes before they even entered the courtroom.
Exactly. And so, yeah. So, I mean, this is... And we call it the CVE trial, like I say, because they needed these convictions to prove that their program is effective.
Is worthwhile. Yes.
Yeah.
After your next organizational and your guys get going with your more of the CVE counter down there in the Twin Cities to highlight what's wrong with this program, would you come back and visit us?
I would love to.
To
And
give us
people
an
can
update.
follow us on Facebook. Minnesotans Against Islamophobia has a Facebook page. They can follow
You know, in the
us.
spring sometime.
Nice if it was nicer weather for my return trip.
And then I understand the men are all held in Hennepin County Jail, don't even know what prison
They're in
system they're gonna
Sherburne
be in.
County, actually. They're very close to you guys,
Oh,
and we don't know where they're going. They're all going different places, probably.
So by then, the public
we'll
will
know where they are.
where
yes.
they're at and an update. It'd be really nice if the mom would want to come on.
Yeah,
talk with us.
and they would. They're all working very hard. So I'm here in the afternoon. It was just impossible. 2 of the moms speak pretty good English. Gulad's mother does not speak English, so she has a very, very hard time.
Yeah.
But Ian Farah or Farhio Hussein would come with me.
Okay. Well, that would be great. And we need to follow this story very closely, carefully, because it's terribly important to the future of the country as well as the future of the immigrants in America. So,
They talked for the whole hour.
good. I'm so glad
nonstop.
you did. But it was so interesting and so informative. I just feel my head is just swollen to twice its size now. I know so much more. Well, thank you so much for joining us, for Robin Hensel, for our special guest Karen Schraufnagel. We are so pleased. We are so pleased that you could join us, and please join us again. For Can We Talk? I'm Teresa Scorsese. Bye.